The Rough Draft Podcast is sponsored by Unicorn.com, the world's premier esports betting site. Bet on your favorite games like CSGO, Dota 2, and League of Legends, and earn Unicoins through successful bets, or use Unicorn's exclusive Connect program, where you can earn Unicoins just by playing some of your favorite games. Use your earnings to enter Unicorn's raffles for exciting prizes like Logitech peripherals or CSGO skins. So join Chase and Walter and prove who really is the esports gambling expert. Unicorn.com. Log on today. Hello, Internet! This is Walter Ceades Fedczuk welcoming you back to Day 5 of our 2017 European Spring Split team-by-team preview show, podcast, episode. I don't know what to call us anymore. We're on the YouTubes, we're on the SoundCloud, we're on the Patreon. If you haven't checked it out, you guys should head over to our Patreon, www.patreon.com/Rough Drafts Pod if you enjoy what we're doing. Just a shameless little plug. And by us, I am of course talking about my truly good friend and co-host, Chase RedShirtKing Wassenar. Chase, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. You know, I don't know what this is either anymore. It's whatever the viewers want it to be. That's my answer. You want this to be a show or a podcast? This is where we break down all of this league stuff, and I love doing the previews. I'm very excited to talk about this team because this was a team that we completely misjudged when we were previewing summer, as did practically everybody else. Yeah, I don't think this was something that a lot of people saw coming, and now it's fun because we get to look at it and say, like, well, was that an outlier or is this the new normal? And you could say that opinions could be spliced down the middle on that one.
Your puns are very awful, my friend.
You've
had a couple of really, really bad ones lately.
When you're feeling the hot hand, you should ignore it entirely and go with the bad puns.
No subtlety here with the Jamal Crawford of esports puns. Yes, we are in fact talking about Splyce, as I'm mocking your terrible showmanships. Splyce. They made no changes after a very successful summer split that followed a not so successful spring split where they fought and stayed out of relegation. In the summer, they took second place behind new dynasty organization G2 Esports. They took second place in the summer playoffs, again losing to new European dynasty organization G2 Esports. They took first place in the European regional over the Unicorns of Love in what was kind of a little downer for us as we were watching them. We thought they were going to just sweep through it, and then Unicorns of Love were really, really plucky, and we'll get to them next week. And they went to the World Championship. They bowed out after being in a rather rough group. They did get one win in that group that included Royal Never Give Up, Samsung, the runners-up to the entire tournament, and Team Solo Mid. God rest my soul. They won some awards. They had the best coach of the summer split over in Europe with YamatoCannon. I think that was pretty well-deserved. And they had 3 All-Pros on all 3 different teams. Wonder took the first team All-Pro honors. Trashy was second team All-Pro. And Senkux took third team All-Pro. And they ran it all back. It's the same roster. Wonder in the top lane. Trashy in the jungle. Senkux in the mid lane. Kobbe as the AD carry. Mickey as the support. And YamatoCannon as the head coach. Chase, what do you think? Why would they run this back?
You run it back because you made incredible leaps and bounds from the spring split. I mean, obviously, there are some problems that we're going to talk about with this team. You know, it's not a perfect team by any means. There are some flaws that need to be addressed, but just looking at the growth between spring and summer, you can just tell, you know, how big a difference a split makes. Just having that extra experience under your belt, having played on the LCS stage and getting used to what it's like to play in front of that size of a crowd, getting used to, having weeks where the games aren't bouncing your way and having to recover mentally from that. There are a lot of really important lessons, and YamatoCannon absolutely deserved his Best Coach of the Year award because he helped facilitate these lessons being learned and getting these guys in the right mindset to be as dominant as they were. And that summer split was an amazing performance up until the regionals. And it's one of those things where now you have to look at it and say, were the regionals the statistical outlier? Was this kind of the end result of a lot of things that had kind of been bubbling under the surface coming to fruition? Is this kind of what we should expect moving forward? Is it something to do with, the pressure of that kind of moment? We don't know. There are a lot of questions that need to be answered, but you don't get answers to those questions by rocking the boat and mixing everything around. You figure it out by running it back, looking at the roster you had and saying, what do we really have here in the long run? Because you can always make changes between the spring and the summer. You can always make those adaptations if you need to, if one of these pieces don't work. They don't use any import slots right now. If they need to make changes, they could probably make changes. But the most important thing is that right now, there's no sign that they do need to make those changes. There are a lot of signs that say that these problems are the kind of things that they did such a good job fixing after the spring split. So I really like the fact that they ran it back. That's one of the things that gets me very excited about this team, is just the potential to build off of what we saw going forward.
Absolutely. You nailed everything I thought about this team. I even want to expand the sample size, not just from the regionals versus the summer split, but as a whole, looking at the spring and the summer split and just seeing how different the two teams were. The spring, obviously, Wonder was pretty much their only bright spot, and that was just because they funneled a lot of resources and gold and et cetera into him, and that's why he's shown they really played around a style that allowed him to be successful. And then we go into the summer, and Trashy definitely was improved. Kobbe was a revelation when you look at, he was the guy that we're looking at going, man, he's really the issue coming into the summer. He really needs to play better. Fedczuk slowly and steadily improved after a spring split where he didn't seem very comfortable outside of a couple games. That, to me, is going to be the biggest story of this entire split for them, is what is the new normal? Is it that, did they overperform in the summer and they fall back down to earth? Is it that the spring was it was their first split in, they didn't know what they were doing, they were trying to adjust everything? So I think, like you said, the only way to answer that question of which Splyce are we is to run it back, as you said so yourself. And that's basically it. I mean, what else, is there anything else about this team that excites you? Is there any particular storyline that you're really like, yeah, this is exactly what it's going to be? Or is it just that, yeah, we get to see another split and see which team they are?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I think if you're looking about what parts of running it back are the most exciting, you have to look at Trashy, and I think you have to look at Fedczuk. I mean, Wonder being a great player, we weren't expecting him to be this great, but we did notice in the spring split that he was the guy that was getting the majority of their resources. They obviously had a lot of faith in him as far as playing through him and understanding what his role in their win condition was going to be. Mm-hmm. Now, they did readjust resources so that it wasn't quite as top-heavy, literally and figuratively, as it had been in the spring split. And that was mostly facilitated by the fact that Trashy and Fedczuk took huge steps forward. Mm-hmm. Trashy was a guy I predicted to take a huge step forward in the spring, was a little bit disappointed by how he performed there, but then, redoubled my enthusiasm with how he performed in the summer. He just has a very good understanding of what his team needs at any given time. He's very selfless in that regard. He wasn't a kind of guy that was stealing a lot of kills or a lot of resources from the rest of his teammates. Right. And Fedczuk finally felt like we found a comfortable meta for him. He's not going to be able to style on people the same way that he did back when he was in the Challenger Series, but he can outscale and he can team fight very well. And he, finally accepted that necessary transition, I think. And now we get to see what that looks like moving forward. It's much more of an ideological shift that is the most fun part of seeing it run back, because now we see The system is established. YamatoCannon has done his job of telling us what is Splyce during a successful split. What are the win conditions they're looking for? Where are the resources trying to go? We now know all of these things.
Correct.
And because we know that, now they can refine it. Now they can go back over with a comb and be like, okay, so where were the inefficiencies here? What can we do with Trashy or Senkux's champion pool in this new meta? What can we do with Mickey to make sure that he is playing more like the guy we saw in the regular season, who was roaming around very successfully and getting key vision for his team, and less like the guy that we saw in a lot of their losses, who was getting caught out by skill shots all the time because he was venturing a little bit too far without that vision. So there are a lot of things that can still be built upon and improved upon, but there's a framework that we are now very well aware of and that we know can work. And when you know that the framework is there and the infrastructure is set up to enhance that, then you get to start doing little things. And as an analyst, it's so much more fun to watch teams try to tweak little parts of their game than having to watch teams just wholesale make these massive changes and, spend weeks just figuring out which parts of the system work and don't, and overreacting to certain weeks and then making changes in the opposite direction. This is, to me, just a much more interesting team to watch.
I agree 100%. Yeah. Just running it back, it's there's not a whole lot to add, I think, when there's not many changes that are made. But I do want to bring up a point I brought up earlier, Kobbe.
Yes.
I don't think that any one player on this team typifies the type of season that Splyce had. He is, as a microcosm, is the defining factor of Splyce's failures in the spring versus their resurgence into the summer and success, up until that playoff and then heading into Worlds and being just in such a tough group. He had a lot of problems in that group at Worlds, especially, against Doublelift and Biofrost, against Mata and Uzi, against Core JJ and Ruler. Yeah, see, Wild Turtle's still stuck in my head as a TSM fan.
I know. You've already started to accept that. Just give in, Walter.
But he typified that difference of failure and success. So, Chase.
Yes.
You have him down as your player that you're nervous about.
I am nervous.
Why is that? Why are you nervous about Kobbe?
Because whenever a player makes a sudden jump like that, it doesn't feel very sustainable, especially because of the circumstances under which that happened. I used to call this the Giants gaming corollary because we saw this a lot with Audrey. Is we would get a new support and suddenly it's like, oh right, they do know how to play in the bot lane. Like this Godford guy is so much better than the support that we had before this, and it's like, oh well, now we can play around it, and that got exciting, and then that got old, so then they needed a new support, and they kept making these kinds of changes, but the whole idea was a below average or average tier AD carry getting from a terrible support to an average support makes a big leap comparatively, and that's what I think we saw when you look at Kobbe's stats, because when you look at him in the regular season, it's not like he was really dominating foes week in and week out. His most successful champion was Sivir, as far as just pure raw numbers go. He was obviously incredibly dominant on the Caitlyn as well, and that's something you would point to as maybe a more lane-focused AD carry if you want to look at, well, he can do well in lanes, but in all reality, the reason he did so well is because he did a very good job of utilizing power spikes in team fights. This team won by team fighting successfully. And Mickey, did a great job of providing vision, allowing these roams to happen, setting up these team fights time and time again. But now we have a lot of film that tells us what Mickey likes to do. And now we have a lot of film that tells us the kinds of pathing that Splyce likes to make and what objectives they tend to fight for. We now know what their tendencies are as far as, where, what side of the map they want to play around. And this makes them exploitable. It does not mean that they are going to be exploited. It just means that they are capable of being exploited in a very different way. And what we saw in the spring was not a guy who was mechanically all that terrible. In fact, his Ezreal games, his Caitlyn games, even back then, by the numbers, were very good. In fact, the numbers weren't all that different if you look at it from just raw stats. But the difference was that he wasn't required to be playing on the back foot every game. He wasn't constantly getting ganked because the rest of his team was calling enemies' attention down. But now teams are going to look at it, and if I'm G2 or if I'm, the Unicorns of Love, and this is one of those things where, think about how differently we see both Splyce and the Unicorns of Love if the Unicorns of Love win Game 5 and go to Worlds instead of Splyce, right? We're having an entirely different conversation about how good we feel about this coaching and with a roster and how well they're able to prepare for big games if they lose that one game. They were one game away from being an entirely different type of team to talk about. And I don't think we should forget that. I don't think we should forget how easy it was at Worlds for teams to just target that bot lane, put Kobbe on the back foot, and make him absolutely useless in team fights.
Agreed.
And in a meta where AD carries are already feeling that way, that's a concern to me. It's that glowing, target, basically, that is going to constantly be on their backs until they figure out how to, hide that deficiency. And I just don't see where that's going to be yet.
There's this discussion anytime you talk about stats and you have giant variances. You have very low lows, you have very high highs. There's always this discussion in sports, particularly when you talk about fantasy, football, when you're talking about just players in general, their actual statistical breakdowns, how well they're playing. There's some sort of regression towards a mean. And we've only seen 2 splits of Kobbe. So we've seen a very low and we've seen a very high. So now I think this spring, we're going to see it start to come towards some sort of center. So then we're going to have 3 different data points of, okay, Kobbe is here, Kobbe is here, Kobbe is now here. So now it's that determination of how far to either the good or the bad side is this central, this third point, because that then starts to bring his averages one way or the other. And I think it's very important for Splyce to have that center, that third point, be as close to that upper side as possible. Now there is a chance that upper echelon that he was at throughout the course of the summer split, that's where his second point lands too. Maybe they're just excellent in the summer split. Maybe they're just excellent during the regular season because it's a lot more carefree, there's less pressure on them, and then as the pressure ratchets up, then they start having some issues, as we saw, a very high pressure situation against the Unicorns of Love, where they had a couple of games where they were on elimination point, and they really had to fight back, and they really had to, claw their way to that world's berth. And then on the world stage, it's just they're outclassed. Doublelift, Uzi, and Ruler are, probably top 10 AD carries in the world, and Kobbe, you played well in the summer split, but you're in Europe. There's not a lot of great AD carries in Europe. Sorry, dude. Reckless and Sven are great, but the rest of it's kind of mediocre. So I think that's very important for their success moving forward into this split, as is the continued improvement of the most dashing man in esports, YamatoCannon.
Yeah.
That man knows how to wear a suit.
I'll
give him that.
Incredibly fashionable.
And he knows how to coach young players. Surprisingly, he knows how to coach young players. Chase, when you look at the coach of the split, YamatoCannon, why do you think he is the most important factor in determining the actual success of the team this split?
Well, this is a test that YamatoCannon has never quite passed yet. And it's what happens when you give him a good team and tell him, get the most out of this roster. Now, he's very good at player development. If you look at, for example, Rawcat's summer stats versus their spring stats in 2015, you can see a huge leap in terms of what they were capable of when the playoffs and everything rolled around, because he did a very good job at taking the young guys and getting them to understand the system, what it meant to be a pro player, getting them ready for game day. He is good at all of those things, and those are very important skills to have. Let me be clear. This is not a knock on YamatoCannon. It is big praise, because it is very hard to develop talent at an LCS level. League of Legends is still very young as an esport. We don't have a whole bunch of, guys that we can point to and say, yes, they did a great job of developing all this talent forward. We have options like CJ Entis of how to do the exact opposite of developing talent, but we don't have a lot of coaches we could say, provably, this team is better because he was there. And there's no way you could look at the difference between Splyce in the spring and the summer and not attribute a good chunk of that to how YamatoCannon built a system that these players could work within and got them from a team that looked scared to be on the big stage to a team that did very well in best of twos and constantly adapting to opponents when necessary. My big concern is now we need him to do a very different kind of job, because it's an entirely different job when you say, okay, now we have the pieces, now we have the system, now your main job is to go in and scout enemy teams and be prepared for whatever they're going to throw at you. And this is where I get nervous about YamatoCannon, because that is a strength that's not panned out. In the 2015 regionals with Roccat, he got them very close. We got a game 5 against Origin that probably was the deciding series in terms of who was going to get that world spot. But he couldn't close it out, and both games 4 and 5 were games that people pointed to and said that pick and ban made no sense, especially given the team that they were playing against. And if you look at Splyce, that one game away again in these regionals, they didn't seem to have a great understanding of how to play against the Unicorns of Love. It was an incredibly sloppy series. It was a series in which I didn't feel good about either team afterwards.
I remember.
They got a win against Royal Never Give Up, and that's great at Worlds, but Royal Never Give Up was also floundering at Worlds. So, to a certain extent, I don't know. I have concerns about whether he is the right coach for the kind of job that they're now looking at. It's going to require him to change his mentality and accept, look, the things that I'm very good at teaching, the players already know. So now I need to be growing with them and understanding how, teams are going to be gunning for us every week, because now we're seen as a top team. So we're the ones with targets on our backs. We have to be ready for everything the league's going to throw at us. We've got to have, our scouting on a week-to-week basis has to be as sharp as possible. Mm-hmm. And we have to be prepared for what happens if Kobbe does take a step back, or if Wonder isn't able to be as dominant as he was last split, or meta changes and how that's going to affect Senkux's champion pool. These are very different problems than the problems that he's proven to be able to solve so far. And while he certainly has the ability to do it, and Splyce is in as good a position as anybody to do it, it still needs to be something that we talk about, because it's something that historically YamatoCannon has not been the most successful at. But this is his chance to prove it. And if he does, Splyce is going to be a dominant team once again. That's why he's my X factor.
Fair enough. I can agree with that. I do think that the thought about player development versus already a pre-established system, I think there still is an aspect of player development to it. But you are correct that YamatoCannon has hit this point where it doesn't work anymore, that him as a coach just doesn't work with those players. And whether it is just he knows how to teach players how to play and doesn't know how to fine-tune, he doesn't understand the aspects of adapting in mid-series in that very last game, of having that sort of trump card, are definitely valid points. I'm curious that the top 2 teams in Europe made no changes. And Splyce had such difficulty overcoming G2 in that regards. Now the structure of the European series will help a little, because I'll assume that Splyce will end up with the group with H2K. I would think that would be what G2 would want to do with their first pick, is be like, all right, Splyce was the other good team. Let's get them in the other group so we don't have to worry about him. Play him as little as possible. So there will be some gamesmanship there, and I'll be very curious as to how Splyce deals with H2K, when that seems like that's probably going to be the group that they're against. But we will see. Chase, at the end of the day, where do you come down on this team? Where do you think they're going to end up at the end of it all?
Well, to be fair, I bring up all these questions about YamatoCannon and about Kobbe. I bring them up because they're things that I think people don't talk about enough, and that they need to be brought up as discussions.
Yeah.
My answer is I think that Splyce is going to figure it out. I still think they're a top 4 team. I'm not willing to... I don't think they're going to be finalists. I think that other teams have gotten better around them. And I think that it's very hard to, basically do the massive leap that they did last split. You can expect a little bit of a regression to the mean. I think that would be entirely reasonable. But I think they've absolutely built a roster and an organization that has the ability to step up and be that kind of team. I'd feel a heck of a lot better if they had an official analyst on staff, because that's something that I think you need in this day and age. And right now they currently don't. So certainly if they make any big infrastructure changes before the season starts, or even mid-season, I could see that helping out as well. But regardless, I think this is a top 4 team. and I'm excited to see what they do.
Fair enough. I will agree with those sentiments. When I first looked at all the teams and first started hemming and hawing over, I was like, this team feels like it's in regression mode. I don't think any other teams have really made changes that justify putting them over Splyce. I don't think, Fnatic's necessarily guaranteed that they're a top 3 team. I don't think that H2K has necessarily guaranteed they're going to be in that top 2 at the end of it all again. So I would agree. I'd say that Splyce is definitely, to me, a top 4 team in terms of projecting outwards a 9-week regular game season and getting into the playoffs. I think the semifinals are very doable. I will be curious at what type of adjustments they make as a team when it does come to them playing against G2, because they'll play against them at least once with sort of group format setup. It's kind of weird, but they'll play against them at least once. That series will be one of the ones that I circle, and that's a podcast. And Splyce's logo is in fact a circle. It all comes back on itself. It's a circle. Everything in life is a circle. But that's been our show. And we're going to be out for the weekend. You guys can come back on Monday when we're going to cover one more North American team and one more European team. You guys can follow us on Twitter over the weekend. Maybe I'll leak out a little hint. I'm going to leave you all in suspense. Ooh, you guys can follow me at Ceades_LOL. Chase, where can the good folks at home hound you all weekend with our terrible, terrible previews?
You can find me at RedShirtKing. I'd love to hear from Splyce guys, whether you're anxious for the upcoming split, whether you would have liked to see, maybe, again, some big-name analysts come in to kind of help anchor the coaching staff. And I want to see from the rest of you guys why you think I'm ridiculous for even questioning the glory that is potato famine. YamatoCannon. So we'll see what happens. It'll be fun.
Well, that does it for us. Come back on Monday. We'll have another European team and another North American team. And until then, goodbye, Internet. Hey there, Ceades here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. And if you enjoyed today's episode, consider supporting us at www.patreon.com/roughdraftspod. For just $1 a month, you can join your fellow listeners in our patron-only Discord channel and help keep the content coming. Or join our VIP club, where $1 a show or $8 a month gets you first priority on all patron content, like our patron-only Q&As. And check us out on all of our social media: Twitter @RoughDraftsPod, Facebook.com/RoughDraftsPod, SoundCloud.com/esportsroughdrafts, as well as on iTunes and YouTube by just searching for the Rough Drafts Podcast. Thanks for listening, and goodbye, Internet.